The pen he offered me felt heavy, like a weapon he did not know was unloaded. He spoke about new beginnings, about how much younger she made him feel, while I sat in the silk dress he bought me. I listened politely. I let him finish. Beneath the table, my phone buzzed once. The final authorization from the board. I was no longer Mrs. Henderson. I was the majority shareholder. He thought he was ending our marriage. He waited for my signature, expecting tears. I capped the pen instead. The silence stretched too long. Why was he suddenly looking at me like he was afraid? The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and rosemary. A meal I had cooked myself, despite the news he had just delivered. The crystal chandelier above us caught the candlelight and threw fractured shadows against the walls. I looked at Richard. He was shifting in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He reached for his wine glass, but his hand trembled slightly. I noticed the way his eyes darted to the hallway, as if expecting someone to intervene. There was no one to intervene. There was only me and the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My name is Eleanor Henderson. I am 68 years old, and I live in a stone house on the north side of Chicago. The house smelled of old paper and lemon polish, a scent that had settled into the woodwork over 40 years. In the corner of the living room stood a grand piano that no one played anymore. It was covered in a thick woolen cloth to keep off the dust. I ran my hand over the keys sometimes when I was alone, just to feel the ivory under my fingertips. Around my neck, beneath the silk of my dress, rested a small silver key on a chain. It was cold against my skin. Richard did not know it was there. He did not know what it opened. He tapped his fork against the plate, a nervous habit he had developed in recent months. The sound was sharp against the china. I watched his hand. It was the same hand that had held mine at our wedding. Now it held a pen he hoped would sever us. I felt the phone buzz again in my lap. I did not look at it. I knew what the message said. The acquisition was complete. The company was mine. He thought he was selling me out for a younger life. He did not realize he had signed himself into my employ. I took a sip of water. The glass was cool and heavy. I set it down without a sound. Something about the way he swallowed made the back of my neck go cold. He was waiting for me to break. He wanted the drama. He wanted the tears so he could feel justified in leaving. I would not give him that satisfaction. I would not give him anything. If you have ever sat across from someone you loved while they dismantled your life, you know this silence. It is not empty. It is full of things unsaid. It is full of calculations. Before we go further, I want to ask you where you are sitting tonight. Are you in a kitchen late at night with a cup of tea? Are you in a bedroom where the house is too quiet? Tell me in the comments if you have ever felt invisible in your own home. Share this with one woman who needs to know she is not alone. We do not shout. We do not beg. We wait. I looked at the pen on the table. It was black and expensive. It looked like a tool of power, but it was just plastic and ink. Real power was not in the pen. Real power was in the vault. Real power was in the shares. I smoothed the silk of my dress. The fabric whispered against my skin. I stood up slowly. The chair legs did not scrape the floor. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The lights of the cars passed by like distant stars. I turned back to the room. Richard was still sitting. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago. I did not speak. I did not need to. The papers were on the table. They were unsigned. They would remain unsigned. I walked past him toward the kitchen. I stopped at the doorway. I touched the frame with my hand. The wood was smooth and worn. I knew every inch of this house. I knew every secret it held. I knew where the documents were kept. I knew where the truth was buried. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the light. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The silence was absolute. I opened the drawer where I kept the matches. I struck one against the box. The flame flickered in the dark. I lit the candle on the counter. I watched it burn. I waited for the next step. I knew something was already in motion. Richard had hands that knew how to build things. He was not born wealthy. He started with a toolbox and a truck. He spent 20 years constructing offices and warehouses across the Midwest. His palms were rough from the work. The calluses never fully went away, even after he stopped lifting the heavy beams. He used to say, "Never build on land you do not own." He said it when we bought the first plot. He said it when we incorporated the business. He said it when we bought this house. I thought he was talking about real estate. I thought he was talking about money. I did not know he was talking about loyalty. I did not know he was talking about me. We ate dinner at the same table every night for 30 years. The table was oak and solid. It had survived 2 moves and 3 renovations. We sat in the same chairs. He sat on the left, I sat on the right. The routine was a comfort. It was a rhythm we did not have to speak about. On Sundays, we had roast chicken. He carved the meat, I made the gravy. The smell of thyme and garlic filled the kitchen. It was a warm smell. It was a safe smell. On Tuesdays, we had pasta. He grated the cheese, I chopped the basil. The knife made a steady sound against the board. Chop, chop, chop. It was the sound of a life built together. I remember the way he folded his napkin after every meal. He folded it into a perfect square. He placed it beside his plate. He did not leave it crumpled. He did not leave it on the chair. He respected the table. He respected the home. Or so I thought. The kitchen walls were painted a soft blue. We chose the colour together. We stood in the hardware store holding paint chips up to the light. He chose the blue. He said it looked like the sky after a storm. I liked that description. I liked that he thought about the sky. We hung pictures in the hallway. They were photographs of us over the years. There was one from our 10th anniversary. We were standing in front of the first office building. We were smiling. We looked tired but happy. There was one from our 20th. We were in Italy. We were holding wine glasses. The sun was in our eyes. There was one from our 30th. It was taken last year. We were standing in this dining room. He was looking at the camera. I was looking at him. I did not notice then that his eyes were not on me. They were past me. They were focused on something behind me. I did not notice the distance in his stance. I did not notice the way his hand was not touching my waist. I thought it was just the angle of the photo. I thought it was just the light. I was wrong. The loss I feel now is not in the big things. It is not in the house or the money. It is in the small things. It is in the coffee cup he left on the counter this morning. It is still there. The rim has a chip in it. He always used that cup. He said it fit his hand better than the others. I have not washed it. I have not moved it. I look at it when I walk past the sink. The coffee inside is cold and dark. It has a film on the surface. It looks like a stagnant pond. I do not pour it out. I let it sit. It is a marker of when he was here. It is a marker of when he was mine. The house is quiet now. The clock on the wall ticks loudly. Tick, tick, tick. It measures the seconds since he left the room. I sit in the chair he vacated. The seat is still warm. I can feel the heat through the fabric. I place my hand on the cushion. I hold it there until the heat fades. I listen to the house settling. The pipes groan in the walls. The floorboards creak under the weight of the night. I used to find these sounds comforting. They meant the house was alive. They meant we were safe. Now they sound like warnings. They sound like the structure is shifting. I look at the table. The plates are cleared. The candles are burned down. The wax has pooled on the holders. It looks like tears. I wipe them away with a cloth. The cloth comes away stained. I rinse it in the sink. The water runs clear. I hang it on the rack to dry. I walk back to the dining room. I stand in the doorway. I look at the empty chair. Something about the way the shadow fell across it made the back of my neck go cold. It looked like someone was sitting there, but the room was empty. I turned off the light. I walked to the hallway. I looked at the photographs on the wall. The one from the 30th anniversary was slightly crooked. I reached up to straighten it. My fingers touched the glass. It was cold. I pushed it until it was level. I stepped back to look at it. The frame caught the light from the hallway lamp. For the first time since the dinner, I felt something that was not grief. It was clarity. I saw the picture clearly. I saw the distance in his eyes. I saw the lack of touch. I saw the truth. I walked to the kitchen. I picked up his coffee cup. I held it in my hand. It was heavy. It was solid. I set it down gently. I did not break it. I did not throw it. I left it there. I went to the living room. I sat on the sofa. I listened to the silence. I waited for the phone to ring. I knew it would. I knew the news was coming. I knew the land was shifting. I smoothed my skirt. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. The triggering event was not a death. It was an announcement. It happened at the anniversary dinner. Richard stood up from the table. He did not look at me. He looked at his hands. He said, "I cannot do this anymore." He said, "I need to be happy." He said, "She makes me feel alive." He did not say her name. He did not need to. I knew who she was. I had seen the texts. I had seen the receipts. I had seen the hotel bills. I did not say anything. I did not scream. I dropped the fork. It fell from my hand to the plate. It did not clang. It landed on the folded napkin. The sound was muffled. It was like a whisper. That was the grief. One physical detail. The silence of the fork. I sat there for 10 minutes after he stopped speaking. I watched the candle flame flicker. It danced in the draft from the window. I did not move. I did not cry. I let the words settle in the room. I let them become real. Then the doorbell rang. I stood up. I walked to the door. I opened it. Standing there was a young woman. She was holding a bouquet of flowers. They were white lilies. They smelled sweet and heavy. She smiled at me. It was a bright smile. It did not reach her eyes. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Henderson." She said, "I am Claire." She said, "Richard asked me to come." She said, "He thought you might need support." She stepped past me into the hallway. She did not wait for an invitation. She walked into the living room. She placed the flowers on the piano. She touched the woolen cloth. She smoothed it with her hand. She looked at me. She said, "This is a beautiful home." She said, "It must be hard to leave." She said, "Richard said you would understand." She said, "He said you are practical." She walked to the dining room. She looked at the table. She looked at the empty chair. She looked at the papers. She picked up the pen. She rolled it between her fingers. She said, "You should sign these." She said, "It will be easier for everyone." She said, "He does not want to fight." She said, "He wants to move forward." I looked at her. She was wearing a blue dress. It was silk. It was the same color as the kitchen walls. I recognized the fabric. I recognized the cut. I had bought that dress for myself last year. I had never worn it. I said I will think about it. She smiled again. It was the same smile. Bright, tight, unearned. She said, "Take your time." She said, "But not too much time." She said, "The company needs stability." She said, "He needs to focus." She walked back to the hallway. She picked up her purse. It was expensive leather. It was new. She said, "I will check on you tomorrow." She said, "He wants me to make sure you are okay." She opened the door. She stopped. She looked back at me. She said, "Do not make this difficult, Eleanor." She said, "It is already done." She left. I closed the door. I locked it. I stood in the hallway. The house was quiet. The flowers smelled too sweet. They smelled like a funeral. I walked to the piano. I touched the flowers. The petals were soft. They were already falling. I picked one up. It was white and fragile. I crushed it in my hand. It turned brown. I dropped it on the floor. I walked to the dining room. I sat in my chair. I looked at the papers. I looked at the pen. I looked at the silence. Something about the way she said my name made the back of my neck go cold. She did not say Mrs. Henderson. She said Eleanor. She assumed familiarity. She assumed ownership. I picked up the pen. I held it in my hand. It was heavy. It was loaded. I capped it. I set it down. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I opened the drawer. I took out the matches. I struck one. The flame flickered. I lit the candle. I watched it burn. I waited for the next step. I knew something was already in motion. The antagonist had arrived. She was in my house. She was touching my things. She was speaking my name. But she did not know the key around my neck. She did not know the vault. She did not know the shares. She thought she was winning. She thought she was taking. She did not know she was walking into a trap. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. The domestic shift began on a Tuesday morning with the light. I woke up at 6 as I always did. The sun was rising over the lake. The room was grey and quiet. I reached for the robe on the chair. It was not there. I sat up. The robe was on the floor. It had been moved during the night. I picked it up. The fabric was cool. I put it on. I walked to the hallway. The keys were gone from the hook. The brass hook was bare. The wood around it was lighter where the keys used to hang. I stood there for a moment. I touched the hook. It was smooth. I went to the kitchen. Claire was there. She was making coffee. She used my mug, the blue one with the chip. She handed it to me. She said, "You do not need the keys anymore." She said, "I am here to manage the house." She said, "Richard wants you to rest." She smiled. It was the same smile. Bright, tight, unearned. I took the mug. The coffee was too strong. It tasted like burnt earth. I drank it anyway. I did not argue. I sat at the table. The routine had changed. Richard used to sit on the left. Now Claire sat on the left. She had his chair. She had his mug. She had his view of the garden. I sat on the right. I sat in my own chair, but it felt like I was visiting. She opened the mail. She sorted it into piles. Bills, junk, personal. She kept the bills. She gave me the junk. She said, "I will handle the finances." She said, "It is too much stress for you." She said, "You do not need to worry about the numbers." I looked at the junk mail. It was advertisements for grocery stores. It was coupons for soap. I held the paper. It was thin. It crumbled in my hand. I said, "Okay." I said, "I trust you." She looked surprised. She expected a fight. She wanted a fight. It would justify taking more. I gave her nothing. I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked at the garden. The roses were blooming. They were red and heavy. They needed pruning. Richard used to prune them. Now they were overgrown. They looked wild. They looked untamed. They looked like me. Claire cleared her throat. She said, "The utility bill is high." She said, "You leave the lights on." She said, "We need to cut costs." She said, "Richard said to check the thermostat." I turned around. I looked at her. She was holding the bill. It was a printed sheet. It was not the official statement. It was a copy. I said, "I will be more careful." I said, "I will turn them off." She nodded. She put the bill in her pocket. She stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. She said, "Maria is coming today." She said, "She will help you." She said, "Do not let her leave early." Maria was the housekeeper. She had worked for us for 10 years. She arrived at noon. She wore her uniform. It was grey and starched. She looked at me. She looked at Claire. She saw the shift. She saw the keys missing. She saw the mug in Claire's hand. She came to me in the hallway. She whispered, "Eleanor." She said, "Be careful." She said, "Things are moving fast." She touched my arm. Her hand was warm. She walked away. She went to the kitchen. I stood in the hallway. I touched the bare hook. I touched the wood. I felt the absence. I went to the living room. I sat on the sofa. I listened to the house. The pipes groaned. The floorboards creaked. The clock ticked. I watched Claire through the doorway. She was on the phone. She was talking to someone. She was saying a number. I recognized it. It was the account balance. I stood up. I walked to the piano. I sat on the bench. I lifted the cloth. The keys were white and yellowed. I pressed one. It made a sound. It was low and deep. It vibrated in the wood. I pressed another. It was sharp. I played a chord. It was discordant. It sounded wrong. Claire looked at me. She frowned. She hung up the phone. She walked over. She said, "You should not exert yourself," she said. "It is not good for your heart." She put the cloth back over the keys. She smoothed it. She patted the wood. She said, "Richard wants to sell this." She said, "It is too big for you." She said, "We can find something smaller." She said, "Something easier." I looked at her hand on the piano. It was resting on the wool. It was possessive. She thought she owned the music. She thought she owned the house. She thought she owned the life. I stood up. I walked past her. I did not speak. I went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer. I took out the matches. I struck one. The flame flickered. I lit the candle. I watched it burn. I waited for the next step. I knew something was already in motion. Something about the way she smoothed the cloth made the back of my neck go cold. She was not cleaning. She was erasing. She was removing the evidence of me. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on, and I was winning. The first disrespect was a comment about memory. It happened 3 days later. We were in the office. I was looking for a document. I knew where it was. It was in the blue folder. I opened the drawer. The folder was not there. Claire was standing behind me. She said, "You are forgetting things." She said, "It is okay." She said, "It happens at your age." She said, "I put it away for you." She said, "You do not need to worry." She said it lightly. She said it like she was helping. But I knew what it was. It was a diagnosis. It was a label. It was a way of saying I was not competent. I turned around. I looked at her. I said, "Where is it?" She said, "I filed it." She said, "It is safe." She smiled. She did not blink. Her eyes were dry. They were clear. They were empty. I walked to the desk. I opened the top drawer. The checkbook was gone. I knew it was there. I had balanced it yesterday. I had put it in the drawer. I had locked it. The lock was open. The key was in the hole. I touched the wood. It was smooth. I felt the empty space. I felt the absence of the book. I said, "You took it." She said, "I managed it." She said, "There were payments." She said, "Richard authorized them." She said, "You do not need to see them." I said, "I need to see them." She said, "No." She said, "You do not." She turned away. She walked to the door. She stopped. She said, "Do not make a scene." She said, "It is undignified." She left. I stood in the office. I was alone. I closed the drawer. I locked it. I put the key in my pocket. I went to the hallway. I looked at the bare hook. I touched it. I went to the kitchen. I opened the cabinet. I looked for the tea. The box was half empty. I took it out. I made tea. I sat at the table. I waited. I waited for evening. I waited for Richard to come home. He came at 7. He walked into the kitchen. He smelled like perfume. It was not mine. It was sweet and floral. It was Claire's scent. He sat down. He did not look at me. He said, "You need to sign the papers." He said the lawyer is waiting. He said it is delaying the sale. I said, "What sale?" He said, "The house." He said, "We talked about this." I said, "No, we did not." He stood up. He said, "Do not be difficult." He said, "You are being selfish." He walked out. I sat at the table. I drank the tea. It was cold. I stood up. I went to the office. I opened the filing cabinet. I looked for the insurance policy. It was gone. In its place was a letter. It was on company letterhead. It was from Richard's business. It was addressed to me. It said, "Dear Eleanor," it said, "this is to confirm the transfer of assets." It said, "As discussed, the funds have been moved to secure the new venture." It said, "You authorize this verbally." It said, "Please sign below." I read it. I held the paper. My hands were steady. My eyes were clear. I did not sign it. I put it in my pocket. I went to the hallway. I stood outside the guest room door. Richard was in there. He was on the phone. He was talking to Claire. I heard his voice through the closed door, low and precise. He was saying a number. I recognized it. It was the balance of my savings. He said, "We can access it next week." He said, "She will not notice." He said, "She thinks it is for the facility." He said, "It is all set." I stood there. I held my breath. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I listened. I heard the whole plan. I heard the timeline. I heard the amount. It was $40,000. It was everything I had left in the main account. I turned away from the door. I went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer. I took out the notebook. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the amount. I wrote down the words. I closed the notebook. I put it back. I went to the living room. I sat in the dark. I did not turn on the lamp. I did not need the light. I could see clearly in the dark. I could see the truth. It was not just theft. It was betrayal. It was my husband. It was my blood. And he was selling me out for cash. I smoothed my skirt. I sat still. I waited for the police to come. I waited for the record. I waited for the next step. I was not afraid. I was not sad. I was ready. The cost was counted. The build was beginning. But it was not their build. It was mine. The isolation happened over 4 weeks. The pictures came down. The curtains closed. By the second week, Mrs. Gable had stopped waving from across the street. It was not a sudden event. It was a slow fading, like a photograph left in the sun. Richard said it was for my privacy. He said too many visitors are stressful. He said, "You need quiet." He said, "We are helping you rest." So he stopped the calls. He stopped the invites. He told the neighbors I was not feeling well. He told them not to disturb me. They believed him. They stopped coming. They stopped waving. They stopped checking in. I stood at the window and watched them. I saw Mrs. Gable walk her dog. She looked at the house. She looked at the curtains. She walked away. I did not open the curtain. I did not wave. I let them think I was gone. I let them think I was sick. I let them think I was weak. Inside the house, I began to watch. I began to listen. I began to keep notes. I pretended to sleep when they came over. I lay on the sofa with a blanket over me. I heard them talk. I heard them plan. I heard them discuss the sale of the house. I heard them discuss the value of the furniture. I heard them discuss the piano. Claire said, "It is worth 5,000. She said, "We can sell it online." She said, "She will not miss it." Richard said, "Wait." He said, "Wait until she signs." He said, "Wait until the power of attorney is done." He said, "Then we can do what we want." I lay there. I breathed slowly. I did not move. I let them think I was asleep. I let them think they were safe. I collected every word. I collected every date. I collected every name. I put it in the notebook. I hid the notebook in the lining of my purse. I carried it with me everywhere. I went to the store. I went to the bank. I went to the post office. I acted normal. I acted like nothing was wrong. I smiled at the cashier. I asked about the weather. I paid my bills. I kept the accounts active. I did not let them freeze them. I did not let them take control. I moved money, small amounts, to a different account. An account they did not know about. An account Arthur had set up years ago. An account for emergencies. I used it now. I paid for a lawyer. I paid for an investigator. I paid for the truth. I did not tell anyone. I did not tell Mrs. Gable. I did not tell my sister. I kept it inside. I kept it quiet. I became a ghost in my own home. I moved through the rooms without sound. I opened doors without creaks. I watched them without being seen. I was studying them. I was learning their patterns. I was learning their weaknesses. Richard was weak. He needed validation. He needed to feel like the boss. Claire was strong. She was the driver. She was the planner. She was the one who made the decisions. Richard followed her. He did what she said. He wanted her approval. He wanted her love. He would do anything for it. Even steal from his wife. Even lie to his family. Even break the law. I watched them. I saw the crack in the armor. I saw the fear in Richard's eyes. He was afraid of her. He was afraid of losing her. He was afraid of being alone. I could use that. I could use that fear. I could turn it against them. But I needed time. I needed evidence. I needed the final piece. I waited. I watched. I listened. I polished the silver key every night. I rubbed the cloth until my fingers hurt. I needed to see myself clearly. I needed to know who was looking back. The reflection was changing. It was getting harder. It was getting sharper. It was getting ready. Richard's voice came back to me exactly the way he used to say it. Never build on land you do not own. They had built a house of cards, and I was the wind. I was waiting for the right moment to blow. I smoothed my skirt. I sat in the chair. I watched the door. I waited for the warning. I knew it was coming. I knew someone would see. I knew someone would speak. I waited for the ally. I waited for the sign. I waited for the move. The isolation was complete. The stage was set. The players were in position. Now the game would begin. Now the truth would come out. Now the cost would be counted. I took a sip of tea. It was hot. I drank it slowly. I watched the steam rise. I watched it disappear. Like their plans, like their lies, like their hope. I was still here. I was still standing. I was still waiting. And I was not alone. Something about the way the floorboard creaked made the back of my neck go cold. It was not the wind. It was a footstep. Someone was in the hall. I turned off the lamp. I sat in the dark. I waited. I listened. I heard the breathing. It was not mine. The footstep belonged to Maria. She stood in the shadow of the hallway archway. Her uniform was crisp. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She looked at the floor. She looked at me. She did not come closer. She spoke barely above a whisper. She said, "The combination was changed yesterday." She said, "They think you do not know." She turned away. She walked back to the kitchen. She did not wait for a response. She did not look back. I stood in the dark. The silence returned. It was heavier now. It was charged. I walked to the living room. I stood in front of the painting above the fireplace. It was a landscape of the lake. The frame was gold and heavy. I reached up. I touched the edge of the canvas. I lifted it slightly. The wall safe was behind it. It was small and steel. It had a keyhole. I reached into my dress. I pulled out the silver key on the chain. It was cold from my skin. I inserted it into the lock. It turned smoothly. It clicked. The sound was loud in the quiet house. I opened the door. Inside was a folder. It was blue. It was thick. I took it out. I closed the safe. I lowered the painting. I walked to the kitchen. Maria was washing dishes. The water was running. She did not turn around. I put the folder on the table. I opened it. The documents were there. They were signed. They were dated. They were forged. I ran my finger over the signature. It was not mine. The ink was too dark. The loop of the E was wrong. I closed the folder. I picked it up. I walked to the dining room. Richard was there. Claire was there. They were eating breakfast. The sun was coming through the window. It hit the table. It made the dust motes dance. Richard looked up. He saw the folder. He stopped chewing. Claire put her fork down. She smiled. She said, "Good morning," she said. "You are up early." I did not answer. I put the folder on the table. I poured coffee. The pot was heavy. The liquid was dark. Filled my cup. I filled Richard's cup. I filled Claire's cup. I sat down. I looked at Richard. I looked at Claire. I looked at the steam rising from the cups. I spoke calmly. I said, "My husband served me divorce papers at our 30th anniversary to marry his 25-year-old secretary." The words hung in the air. They did not fall. They stayed. Richard froze. His hand was on the handle of his cup. Claire's smile vanished. It did not fade. It vanished. 4 sentences of silence followed. I looked at my hands. They were steady on the table. I looked at my eyes in the window reflection. They were clear and hard. I listened to the sound of the clock on the wall. It ticked loudly. I decided what I would do. I would not leave. I would not sign. I would not beg. I took a sip of coffee. It was hot. It burned my tongue. I did not flinch. Richard opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Claire. She looked at me. She said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "You know." I said, "You planned it." I said, "You forged it." She stood up. Her chair scraped the floor. The sound was sharp. She said, "You are confused." She said, "You need help." I said, "No." I said, "You do." I stood up. I picked up the folder. I walked to the hallway. I stopped at the door. I looked back. Something about the way Claire's hand trembled made the back of my neck go cold. She was afraid. She was not used to being afraid. I walked into the living room. I locked the door. I sat on the sofa. I opened the folder again. I read the pages. I memorized the dates. I memorized the amounts. I memorized the names. I closed the folder. I put it on the table. I stood up. I walked to the piano. I lifted the cloth. The keys were white. I pressed one. It sounded true. I pressed another. It sounded clear. I played a chord. It was strong. I let it ring. I let it fade. I waited for the next move. I knew something was already in motion. The key had turned. The safe had opened. The truth was out. The game had changed. And I was holding the pieces. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. The first quiet move happened at night. The house was asleep. Richard was snoring in the guest room. Claire was in the master bedroom. They had swapped rooms. They thought I did not notice. They thought I did not care. I woke up at 2 in the morning. The moon was full. The light came through the window. It painted the floor silver. I got out of bed. I did not turn on the light. I walked to the living room. The folder was on the table. I picked it up. I took out my phone. The screen was bright. I turned the brightness down. I opened the camera. I focused on the first page. The flash was off. I tapped the screen. The shutter clicked silently. I took a picture. I took another. I took a picture of the signature. I took a picture of the date. I took a picture of the witness line. The witness was Claire. Her name was printed there. She had witnessed her own fraud. I saved the photos. I named the folder Evidence. I encrypted it. I sent it to a cloud account. I sent it to myself. I sent it to a lawyer. I did not tell anyone. I did not wake anyone. I did not make a sound. I worked quickly. I worked efficiently. I worked like a professional, because that is what I was. I was not a helpless old woman. I was an investor. I was a partner. I was an owner. I finished at 3. I put the papers back. I aligned the edges. I made sure it looked exactly as it had before. I locked the safe. I lowered the painting. I turned off the phone. I went back to bed. I lay down. I closed my eyes. I slept for 2 hours. I woke up at 6. I made coffee. I drank it. I went about my day. I acted normal. I acted like nothing happened. Claire came down at 9. She looked tired. She had dark circles under her eyes. She said, "Did you sleep well?" I said, "Yes." I said, "You look tired." She touched her face. She said, "I did not sleep well." I said, "You should rest." She frowned. She walked to the table. She looked at the folder. It was there. It was closed. She touched it. She moved it slightly. She said, "You left this out." I said, "I was looking at it." She said, "You should not worry." She said, "It is all handled." I said, "I know." She looked at me. She searched my face. She was looking for fear. She was looking for weakness. She did not find it. She turned away. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator. She took out juice. She drank it. She said, "We are meeting with the lawyer tomorrow." She said, "You need to sign the papers." She said, "It is important." I said, "Okay." She looked surprised. She said, "You will sign." I said, "I will think about it." He said, "Do not make this hard." I said, "I am not making it hard. I am making it right." He stopped drinking. He looked at me. He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I need to understand." He said, "There is nothing to understand." He said, "It is simple." I said, "Nothing is simple." He put the juice down. He walked to the door. He said, "We will talk tomorrow." He left. I watched him go. I watched his car drive away. I went to the office. I opened the laptop. I checked the cloud. The files were there. They were safe. They were secure. I opened the email. I read the message from Robert. He said he received them. He said he is reviewing them. He said he will call at noon. I closed the laptop. I went to the living room. I sat in the chair. I looked at the piano. It was still there. It was still covered. I touched the cloth. It was soft. I smoothed my skirt. I waited for the call. I waited for the news. I waited for the next step. The antagonist believed everything was proceeding. She thought I was confused. She thought I was weak. She thought I was ready to sign. But I was not. I was ready to fight. I was ready to win. I was ready to take it all back. The hands were steady. The eyes were clear. The mind was sharp. The heart was hard. I was not the same woman who sat at the dinner table. I was not the same woman who cried at the funeral. I was someone new. I was someone strong. I was someone who knew the cost. I was someone who counted the build. I was someone who owned the company. I sat in the silence. I listened to the clock. I listened to the wind. I listened to the truth. It was coming. It was close. It was here. I took a sip of coffee. It was hot. I drank it slowly. I watched the steam rise. I watched it disappear. Like their plans, like their lies, like their hope. I was still here. I was still standing. I was still waiting. And I was not alone. I had the files. I had the proof. I had the power. I had the truth. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the phone to ring. I waited for the voice. I waited for the beginning of the end. The move was made. The game was on. and I was winning. But there was one gap. I needed the original trust deed. The copy was not enough. I needed the source. I needed the bank record. I needed the final piece. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. The trusted advisor waited in a specific office. It was on the 10th floor of a building in downtown Chicago. The glass was thick. The view was wide. The air was cool. Jonathan Pierce sat behind a large desk. He was older than me. He was wearier than me. He was smarter than me. He had worked with my father for 30 years. He knew the secrets. He knew the plans. He knew the truth. I sat in the chair across from him. I did not shake hands. I did not smile. I put the folder on the desk. I opened it. I showed him the papers. I showed him the photos. I showed him the proof. He looked at them. He nodded. He said, "I know." He said, "Your father told me." He said, "He told me to wait." He said, "He told me to protect you." I said, "Why did you wait?" He said, "He said you needed to be ready." He said, "You needed to see." He said, "You needed to know." I said, "I know now." He said, "Yes, you do." He leaned forward. He put his hands on the desk. He said, "The trust is active." He said, "The holdings are secure." He said, "The value is $12 million." He said, "It is all yours." I looked at him. I felt the weight of the words. $12 million. It was not just money. It was power. It was control. It was freedom. I said, "What do I do?" He said, "You take it." He said, "You claim it." He said, "You show them." I said, "How?" He said, "You call the meeting." He said, "You invite them." He said, "You reveal the truth." I said, "When?" He said, "Tomorrow." He said, "The anniversary." He said, "It is fitting." I nodded. I stood up. I took the folder. I put it in my bag. I said, "Thank you." He said, "No." He said, "Thank your father." He said, "He loved you." He said, "He knew." I walked to the door. I opened it. I stepped into the hallway. The air was different. It was lighter. It was clearer. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. I waited. I looked at my reflection in the metal doors. I saw the woman there. She was not old. She was not weak. She was not afraid. She was ready. The shift happened in my posture. I stood taller. I breathed deeper. I walked faster. I was not grieving anymore. I was not mourning. I was not losing. I was gaining. I was taking. I was winning. I went to the car. I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I sat for a moment. I looked at the house. It was mine. It was not theirs. It was not Richard's. It was not Claire's. It was mine. I got out. I walked to the door. I opened it. I went inside. I locked it. I went to the living room. I sat in the chair. I looked at the piano. It was still there. It was still covered. I touched the cloth. It was warm. I smoothed my skirt. I waited for the next day. I waited for the meeting. I waited for the reckoning. The hidden power was named. The value was known. The structure was clear. The legal name was Henderson Family Irrevocable Trust. The creator was my father. The time was 20 years ago. The structure was irrevocable. The beneficiary was me. I was the owner. I was the boss. I was the one who held the keys. I took a sip of tea. It was cold. I did not mind. I was warm enough. I was warm enough inside. I had the plan. It was quiet. It was slow. It was mine. I waited for the night. I waited for the silence. I waited for the truth to show itself. I was ready. I was set. I was sure. The advisor had spoken. The truth was told. The power was claimed. The game was changing. And I was holding the winning hand. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. Something about the way the light hit the floor made the back of my neck go cold. It was not the sun. It was a reflection. Someone was watching. I turned off the lamp. I sat in the dark. I waited. I listened. I heard the breathing. It was not mine. It was close. It was inside. I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked out. The street was empty. The car was gone. But the feeling remained. I was not alone. I was never alone. I had the trust. I had the law. I had the truth. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. The feeling of being watched did not leave me. It settled into the corners of the room like dust. I stood by the window for a long time. The street remained empty. The car was gone. But the air felt charged. I turned away from the glass. I walked to the kitchen. I needed to hear them again. I needed to know what they were planning next. I moved quietly. The floorboards knew my weight. They did not creak for me. I stood outside the guest room door. It was slightly ajar. Light spilled out into the hallway. I heard voices. They were low. They were urgent. I controlled my breathing. I breathed through my nose. Slow. Steady. I placed my hand on the wall. The plaster was cool. I leaned in. I heard Claire's voice. She was saying a number. I recognized it. It was the value of the house. She said, "We can list it for 2 million. She said, "The market is high." She said, "We do not need her signature if she is incapacitated." I stood there. I held my breath. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I listened. I heard the whole plan. I heard the timeline. I heard the method. It was not just divorce, it was commitment. They planned to declare me unfit. They planned to take the house while I was locked away. I turned away from the door. I went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer. I took out the notebook. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the amount. I wrote down the words. I closed the notebook. I put it back. For a moment, I thought about calling Jonathan. I thought about stopping it now. I thought about sending the papers today. It seemed briefly possible that I could end it before it began. I could send the email. I could freeze the assets. I could lock them out. I picked up the phone. I held it in my hand. It was heavy. It was cold. I looked at the screen. It was dark. I put the phone down. I decided to wait. I decided to let them come. I decided to let them speak. Because if I stopped it now, they would find another way. They would find another loophole. They would find another excuse. I needed them to commit. I needed them to sign. I needed them to trap themselves. That was the new blow. They were not leaving. They were staying. They were preparing the paperwork for the facility. They were preparing the doctors. They were preparing the neighbors. They were building a case against me. I sat at the table. I looked at the clock. It was midnight. The house was silent. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. I looked at my hands. They were resting on the wood. They were steady. I looked at the window. It was black. I could see my reflection. I looked tired. I looked old. I looked like a victim. But I was not. I was a hunter. I was waiting for the prey to step into the trap. Something about the way the shadow moved across the floor made the back of my neck go cold. It was not the wind. It was not the tree. It was a person. I stood up. I walked to the hallway. I looked into the living room. It was empty. I walked to the front door. I checked the lock. It was engaged. I walked to the back door. It was locked. I walked to the window. It was closed. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. But the stakes had changed. It was no longer about money. It was about freedom. It was about my mind. It was about my name. They wanted to take my sanity. They wanted to say I was lost. They wanted to say I was gone. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. I heard a footstep above me. I looked at the ceiling. It was Richard. He was pacing. He was worried. He knew what they were doing. He knew it was wrong. But he was too weak to stop it. He was caught. He was trapped. He was mine. I took a sip of water. It was cold. I drank it slowly. I watched the glass. I watched the light reflect off the rim. I watched it disappear. Like their plans. Like their lies. Like their hope. I was still here. I was still standing. I was still waiting. And I was not alone. I had the notebook. I had the proof. I had the power. I had the truth. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. The final evidence required a visit to the bank. I drove there in the morning. The sky was grey, the streets were wet. The wipers moved back and forth. Swish, swish, swish. I parked in the lot. I walked to the door. The glass was cold. I pushed it open. The air inside was cool. It smelled of paper and ink. I went to the desk. I asked for Jonathan. He was waiting. He stood up. He shook my hand. His grip was firm. He led me to the office. He closed the door. He sat behind the desk. I sat in the chair. I did not speak. I put the folder on the desk. I opened it. I showed him the photos. I showed him the notes. I showed him the plan. He looked at them. He nodded. He said, "It is enough." He said, "We can stop it." He said, "We can freeze everything." I said, "No." I said, "Not yet." I said, "I need the deed." He stood up. He walked to the wall. He opened the safe. He took out a tube. It was metal. It was silver. He handed it to me. I took it. It was heavy. I opened it. I took out the paper. It was thick. It was cream-coloured. It had the seal. It had the signature. It was the original. I looked at it. I felt the weight of it. It was the land. It was the house. It was the truth. I put it back in the tube. I put the tube in my bag. I stood up. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Be careful." He said, "They are desperate." He said, "Desperate people do dangerous things." I said, "I know." I walked to the door. I opened it. I stepped into the hallway. The air was different. It was heavier. It was thicker. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. I waited. I looked at my reflection in the metal doors. I saw the woman there. She was not old. She was not weak. She was not afraid. She was ready. The shift happened in my posture. I stood taller. I breathed deeper. I walked faster. I was not grieving anymore. I was not mourning. I was not losing. I was gaining. I was taking. I was winning. I went to the car. I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I sat for a moment. I looked at the house. It was mine. It was not theirs. It was not Richard's. It was not Claire's. It was mine. I got out. I walked to the door. I opened it. I went inside. I locked it. I went to the living room. I sat in the chair. I looked at the piano. It was still there. It was still covered. I touched the cloth. It was warm. Richard's phrase came back to me exactly the way he used to say it. Never build on land you do not own. But now it meant something different. It did not mean be careful. It meant be ready. It meant be strong. It meant be sure. I was calm. I was ready. I was set. The evidence was gathered. The proof was complete. The case was closed. I smoothed my skirt. I waited for the next day. I waited for the meeting. I waited for the reckoning. The final piece was in place. The puzzle was complete. The picture was clear. I took a sip of tea. It was cold. I did not mind. I was warm enough. I was warm enough inside. I had the plan. It was quiet. It was slow. It was mine. I waited for the night. I waited for the silence. I waited for the truth to show itself. I was ready. I was set. I was sure. The evidence was Lan's. The truth was told. The power was claimed. The game was changing. And I was holding the winning hand. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window. It was Richard. He was home early. He was not alone. Claire was with him. They were carrying boxes. They were moving in. They were not leaving. They were staying. They were taking over. I stood up. I walked to the door. I opened it. I stood on the porch. I watched them. They saw me. They stopped. They looked at me. They looked at the boxes. They looked at the house. Something about the way Claire smiled made the back of my neck go cold. She thought she had won. She thought she had taken. She did not know she was walking into a trap. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. The confrontation happened in the dining room. It was evening. The table was set. The candles were lit. The light was low. Richard and Claire sat on one side. I sat on the other. The tube was on the table. It was silver. It caught the light. Richard looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "What is that?" I said, "It is the deed." I said, "It is the house." I said, "It is the land." Claire laughed. It was a sharp sound. It was brittle. She said, "You do not own this." She said, "Richard owns this." She said, "He paid for this." I said, "No." I said, "My father bought this." I said, "My name is on the trust." I said, "My name is on the deed." I pushed the tube toward them. It slid across the wood. It made a sound. It was smooth. It was heavy. It stopped in front of Richard. He did not touch it. He looked at it. He looked at me. His hand went still. It rested on the table. It did not move. Claire reached for it. She picked it up. She opened it. She took out the paper. She read the first line. Her face went pale. She read the second line. Her mouth opened. She read the third line. She sat down. She put the paper on the table. She looked at Richard. He looked at the paper. He looked at me. He said, "This is not possible." I said, "It is." I said, "It is legal." I said, "It is binding." I said, "It is done." Claire stood up. Her chair scraped the floor. The sound was loud. She said, "You forged this?" I said, "No." I said, "The bank has the copy." I said, "The lawyer has the copy." I said, "The court has the copy." I said, "It is real." Richard put his head in his hands. He did not speak. He did not move. He did not breathe. Claire looked at me. Her eyes were wide. Her hands were shaking. She picked up her wineglass. She lifted it. She set it down too carefully. It did not make a sound. She said, "You cannot do this." I said, "I can." I said, "I did." I said, "I will." The confusion was first, then the recalculation, then the panic. I saw it in their eyes. I saw it in their hands. I saw it in their breath. They knew they were caught. They knew they were beaten. They knew they were done. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I watched them. I waited. I did not shout. I did not cry. I just sat. I just watched. I just won. The confrontation was over. The truth was told. The power was claimed. The game was finished. And I was the winner. Something about the way the candle flickered made the back of my neck go cold. It was not the wind. It was the air changing. The pressure was shifting. The room was smaller. The walls were closing. They were trapped. I was free. I took a sip of water. It was cool. I drank it slowly. I watched the glass. I watched the light. I watched them. They did not move. They did not speak. They did not breathe. I stood up. I walked to the door. I stopped. I looked back. I said, "You have until morning." I said, "Pack your things." I said, "Leave the keys." I said, "Do not come back." I opened the door. I walked out. I closed it. I locked it. I went to the living room. I sat in the chair. I looked at the piano. I lifted the cloth. The keys were white. I pressed one. It sounded true. I pressed another. It sounded clear. I played a chord. It was strong. I let it ring. I let it fade. I waited for the next step. I knew something was already in motion. The key had turned. The safe had opened. The truth was out. The game had changed. And I was holding the pieces. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. I opened the drawer again. I took out the pen. It was black. It was heavy. I pressed the tip against the paper. The ink flowed dark and wet. I wrote the word, incapacitated. I underlined it twice. The paper absorbed the ink. I closed the notebook. I slid it to the back of the drawer, behind the tea towels. I pushed it until it hit the wood. I closed the drawer. I listened to the click of the latch. It sounded like a lock. I stood in the kitchen. I looked at the phone. It was silent. I walked to the window. I looked at my reflection. I looked tired. I looked old. I looked like a victim. But I was not. I was a hunter. I waited. Jonathan walked around the desk. He stood beside me. He put his hand on my shoulder. It was heavy. It was warm. He said, "They will try to rush you." He said, "They will try to scare you." He said, "Do not sign anything without me." I nodded. I felt the weight of his hand. I felt the weight of the tube. I said, "I will not sign." I said, "I will wait." He took his hand away. He wrote a number on a card. He slid it across the desk. I took the card. I put it in my purse. I stood up. I walked to the door. I opened it. I stepped into the hallway. The air was heavier. I left. I walked into the kitchen. I looked at the table. The candles were still burning. The wax had pooled. It looked like tears. I blew them out. The smoke rose in thin lines. It smelled of burnt wick. I walked to the hallway. I looked at the hook. It was bare. The keys were gone. They had left them. I picked up the ring. It was cold. It was heavy. I put it in my pocket. I walked to the living room. I sat in the chair. I looked at the piano. I lifted the cloth. The keys were white. I pressed one. It sounded true. I pressed another. It sounded clear. I played a chord. It was strong. I let it ring. I waited. The night stretched long after I locked the door. I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the living room and listened to the house. The silence was not empty. It was full of movement. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs. I heard the sound of tape being pulled from a dispenser. Rip, rip, rip. It sounded like fabric tearing. I heard the thud of boxes being placed on the floor. Heavy. Final. I stood up. I walked to the hallway. I stood at the bottom of the stairs. I did not go up. I did not need to. I knew what was happening. They were packing. They were leaving. But they were not leaving quietly. I heard Richard's voice. It was low. It was strained. I heard Claire's voice. It was sharp. It was angry. I walked to the kitchen. I made tea. The kettle whistled. It was a high, thin sound. I poured the water. I watched the steam rise. I waited. An hour passed. The packing stopped. The house was quiet again. I sat at the table. I waited for the morning. The sun came up grey and cold. I went to the front door. I opened it. The air was crisp. I walked to the driveway. Richard's car was still there. The trunk was open. Boxes were stacked inside. Claire was standing by the rear door. She was holding a lamp. It was the one from the guest room. She saw me. She did not smile. She put the lamp in the trunk. She slammed it shut. The sound echoed off the stone walls. Richard came out of the house. He was carrying a bag. It was heavy. He looked at me. He did not speak. He put the bag in the back seat. He closed the door. He leaned against the car. He looked at the ground. His shoulders were slumped. He looked older than he had yesterday. Claire walked around the car. She stood beside him. She put her hand on his arm. He did not look at her. He shook her hand off. It was a small movement, but I saw it. I stood in the driveway. I did not move. I watched them. Claire turned to me. Her face was tight. Her eyes were red. She said, "You think you have won," she said. "This is not over," she said. "We will fight this," she said. "You cannot prove the trust." I said, "It is already proven," I said. "The bank has the records," I said. "The lawyer has the copies," I said. "You have nothing." She laughed. It was a dry sound. It had no humor. She said, "He loved me." She said, "He chose me." I looked at Richard. He flinched. He looked at her. He looked at me. He looked at the car. He did not say anything. He got into the driver's seat. He closed the door. Claire stood on the pavement. She watched him. She knew. He knew. The truth was out. I turned around. I walked back to the house. I went to the kitchen. I stood outside the pantry door. I heard Claire on the phone. She was in the hallway. She thought I was gone. She was talking to someone. Her voice was low. She was saying I never cared about him. She was saying it was always about the company. She was saying he was just the way in. I stood there. I held my breath. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I listened. I heard the whole truth. I heard the calculation. I heard the coldness. It was not love. It was business. It was a takeover. I turned away from the door. I went to the living room. I sat in the chair. I looked at the piano. The cloth was still off. The keys were white. I pressed one. It sounded true. I pressed another. It sounded clear. I played a chord. It was strong. I let it ring. I let it fade. I waited for the next step. I knew something was already in motion. The key had turned. The safe had opened. The truth was out. The game had changed. And I was holding the pieces. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. Richard came back alone 2 hours later. He left the car running. He walked to the door. He knocked. I opened it. He stood on the porch. He looked at his shoes. He said, "She is gone." He said, "I did not know." He said, "I'm sorry." I looked at him. I saw the pain in his face. It was real. It was deep. I said, "I know." He looked up. He said, "Can I come in?" I said, "No." He nodded. He turned around. He walked to the car. He drove away. I closed the door. I locked it. I went to the kitchen. I washed the teacup. I dried it. I put it away. The house was quiet. The boxes were gone. The lamps were gone. The people were gone. But the feeling remained. I was not alone. I was never alone. I had the trust. I had the law. I had the truth. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. Something about the way the light hit the floor made the back of my neck go cold. It was not the sun. It was a reflection. Someone was watching. I turned off the lamp. I sat in the dark. I waited. I listened. I heard the breathing. It was not mine. It was close. It was inside. I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked out. The street was empty. The car was gone. But the feeling remained. I was not alone. I was never alone. I had the trust. I had the law. I had the truth. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made, the game was on, and I was winning. The final confirmation happened at Jonathan's office. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky was clear, the sun was bright. I drove there myself. I parked in the lot. I walked to the building. The lobby was quiet. The carpet was thick. It muffled my steps. I went to the elevator. I pressed the button. I waited. The doors opened. I stepped inside. I pressed 10. The doors closed. I rode up. I looked at my reflection in the metal. I looked calm. I looked ready. I stepped out. I walked to the office. The door was open. Jonathan was standing behind his desk. Richard was sitting in the chair. He looked up when I entered. He stood up. He looked tired. His eyes were red. He did not speak. I sat in the chair beside him. I put my bag on the floor. I took out the tube. It was silver. It was cold. I put it on the desk. Jonathan opened it. He took out the paper. It was thick. It was cream-colored. It had the seal. It had the signature. It was the original. He laid it flat. He smoothed it with his hand. He looked at Richard. He looked at me. He said, "This is the Henderson family irrevocable trust," he said. "It was created 20 years ago." He said, "The value is $12 million." He said, "It is all hers." The moment the antagonist seized the document, Claire was not there, but Richard was. He was the witness. He was the one who needed to see. He looked at the paper. His hand went still. It rested on the arm of the chair. It did not move. His eyes widened. They fixed on the number. $12 million. He blinked. He looked at me. He looked at the paper. He looked at his hands. The silence filled the room. It was heavy. It was thick. It was real. Jonathan did not speak. I did not speak. Richard did not speak. We sat in the quiet. We listened to the clock. It ticked loudly. Tick, tick, tick. It measured the seconds. It measured the loss. It measured the truth. Richard shifted in his chair. The leather creaked. He cleared his throat. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He said, "I did not know." He said, "She told me." He said, "She said you are hiding it." He stopped. He looked at the floor. He shook his head. He said, "I should have known." He said, "I should have asked." The image that closed the confrontation was the paper. It sat on the desk. It caught the light. It was clear. It was solid. It was mine. Richard looked at it. He knew. He understood. He lost. He stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped. He looked back. He said, "I am sorry." He said, "I will not contact you." He opened the door. He left. I sat in the chair. I looked at the paper. I looked at Jonathan. He said, "It is done." He said, "The transfer is complete." He said, "The company is yours." He said, "The house is yours." He said, "The money is yours." I looked at the paper. I saw the name. Henderson Family Irrevocable Trust. I saw the value. $12 million. I saw the signature. It was mine. I signed it. I handed it back. He put it in the briefcase. He closed it. He stood up. He said, "Congratulations." I said, "Thank you." He walked to the door. He opened it. He left. I sat in the chair. I looked at the window. The sun was shining. The city was moving. The world was turning. I was here. I was alive. I was free. I smoothed my skirt. I stood up. I walked to the door. I opened it. I stepped into the hallway. The air was different. It was lighter. It was clearer. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. I waited. I looked at my reflection in the metal doors. I saw the woman there. She was not old. She was not weak. She was not afraid. She was ready. The shift happened in my posture. I stood taller. I breathed deeper. I walked faster. I was not grieving anymore. I was not mourning. I was not losing. I was gaining. I was taking. I was winning. I went to the car. I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I sat for a moment. I looked at the house. It was mine. It was not theirs. It was not Richard's. It was not Claire's. It was mine. I got out. I walked to the door. I opened it. I went inside. I locked it. I went to the living room. I sat in the chair. I looked at the piano. It was still there. It was still covered. I touched the cloth. It was warm. I smoothed my skirt. I waited for the next day. I waited for the meeting. I waited for the reckoning. The hidden power was named. The value was known. The structure was clear. The legal name was Henderson Family Irrevocable Trust. The creator was my father. The time was 20 years ago. The structure was irrevocable. The beneficiary was me. I was the owner. I was the boss. I was the one who held the keys. I took a sip of tea. It was cold. I did not mind. I was warm enough. I was warm enough inside. I had the plan. It was quiet. It was slow. It was mine. I waited for the night. I waited for the silence. I waited for the truth to show itself. I was ready. I was set. I was sure. The advisor had spoken. The truth was told. The power was claimed. The game was changing, and I was holding the winning hand. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. Something about the way the light hit the floor made the back of my neck go cold. It was not the sun. It was a reflection. Someone was watching. I turned off the lamp. I sat in the dark. I waited. I listened. I heard the breathing. It was not mine. It was close. It was inside. I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked out. The street was empty. The car was gone. But the feeling remained. I was not alone. I was never alone. I had the trust. I had the law. I had the truth. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I waited for the morning. I waited for the light. I waited for the end of the beginning. The move was made. The game was on. And I was winning. The weeks passed quietly. The house settled into a new rhythm. I watered the plants on the windowsill. I made coffee in the morning. I opened the window to let the air in. I did not speak of the victory. I did not celebrate. I did not boast. I just lived. Richard sent a letter. It was short. It said, "I am sorry." It said, "I hope you are well." It said, "I will not contact you again." I put it in the drawer. I did not reply. I did not need to. The choice was made. The line was drawn. The end was here. Claire moved away. The company ran smoothly. The trust paid the bills. The house was secure. I sat in the chair. I looked at the piano. It was still there. It was still covered. I touched the cloth. It was warm. Richard's phrase came back to me exactly the way he used to say it. Never build on land you do not own. But now it carried the full weight. It meant everything. It meant survival. It meant dignity. It meant truth. I smoothed my skirt. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I drank it. I looked out the window. The sun was shining. The birds were singing. The world was turning. I was here. I was alive. I was free. If you have ever had to reclaim your own life from those who try to take it, you know this feeling. It is not loud. It is not flashy. It is quiet. It is steady. It is yours. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told you were too old to know your own worth? Have you ever been told you were too weak to hold your own ground? Have you ever been told you were too much trouble to keep around? I want you to know you are not. You are strong. You are worthy. You are enough. And you are not alone. There are others like us. There are others who know. There are others who wait. Come back for the next story. Come back for the next truth. Come back for the next voice. We are here. We are listening. We are waiting. And we are winning. I smoothed my skirt. I sat back in the chair. I watched the sun set. I watched the light fade. I watched the night come. I was ready. I was set. I was sure. The story was over. The life was beginning. And I was the owner.